Today's guest is a regular contributor to the online Psi Encyclopedia, sponsored by the Society for Psychical Research in London. He's written many academic papers, been co-author on one book and solo-authored another on the topic of reincarnation. A massive Koit welcome to Jim Matlock. Hi James, and welcome to KoitCast.
Well, thank you. Yeah, welcome to be here. Call me Jim, please. I prefer to go by Jim. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you for coming on. It's much appreciated, and I'm really gracious for you sparing your time. Let's just jump straight in and say about your paranormal journey. What brought you into the paranormal theatre? What was your introduction, your origin story, if you will? Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got involved.
Right. Okay. Well, I started off in college. I started off wanting to be a writer, creative writer. And I held to that dream all the way through college, and in fact, after college. But when I was, and so I majored in English, which is literature, and minored in psychology. Now, the psychology at that time, and this was at Emory University, and it was in the 70s, early 70s, but still, the psychology at that time was primarily behaviorism at this university. And so that's what I was taught, behaviorism, and I did not like it. I mean, I just could not go along with behaviorism. So when I graduated, I started reading more, and what was coming out then is the New Age literature. And that gradually got me interested in these things. And I found I could not make a living as a writer. And so I remember going to my local library and looking around for a topic, and I was interested now in these metaphysical things, New Age things. And so I looked through that section, and I saw books on reincarnation, and I had never really thought much about it before. I didn't know about it. I was totally agnostic. I was open, but I really didn't know anything about it. But I noticed that theme coming up in the literature that I'd been reading again and again, either a metaphorical sort of rebirth, right, or a literal rebirth, and so it intrigued me. And I started reading, and then I found Ian Stevenson's work, and Ian Stevenson took me into academic parapsychology, and I was hooked.
Excellent. So tell us a bit about your background, because you've got a lot of background, haven't you, with Psi?
I am. So this was in the around 1980 that I started reading on reincarnation. Shifted totally from New Age and got into parapsychology. And by 1985, I was already writing to Stevenson and connecting to people in the field, subscribing to journals, getting into the professional associations and so forth. So I've been at it for a while now. And at one point, I was on the staff of the ASPR. I've also been on the staff of the Rhine Research Center, two major organizations in this field. So even though I'm an anthropologist by training, and I should say I went on and got a PhD in anthropology, but my interest has always been more in parapsychology. And so that's really, and reincarnation research in particular. And that's where I've centered myself, really. And it's been since the mid 80s. So it's quite a while now.
Yeah, long time. So when you were looking around for topics to get involved with, and you were looking through all the parapsychology scenarios, presumably ghosts and stuff were all involved with that at the time.
Right.
They would have been in the books as well back then, ghosts, UFOs, and all these other topics. What was it specifically about reincarnation, do you think, that compelled you to investigate it?
I think that Stevenson made a very strong case through his case reports. I was very intrigued by them. And it just seemed to me that he had something. He was really onto something, but it was a topic that wasn't being, except for Stevenson, really wasn't being explored. These other topics, apparitions, mediumship, I mean, they have very, very long histories in psychical research. This is the older term for parapsychology. They go way back, to late 19th century, Victorian period. And so there wasn't really that much more to do on those, right? But on reincarnation, there really was, and so I came out as a defender in Stevenson when there were a few defenders. It's not like he had none, but I was one of his early vocal ones. And I stayed with it, but it was his research that got me into parapsychology and his research that got me into reincarnation in particular.
Excellent. Okay, so as we go down this rabbit hole then of reincarnation, I suppose it's probably best to start with a definition. So, from your perspective, what is reincarnation?
Right. And I think that is a really important and key question. And I'm glad you started with it because my preference is to be led by the data and let the data tell me what it is, because there are so many definitions. I mean, you get a different idea of what it is if you look at Hinduism and Buddhism, and other traditions and New Age traditions, and they all have different ideas of what it means, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether animals are part of it or not, I mean, whether animals can become humans, humans become animals, and all this that you find in Eastern religions. So to answer questions like that and get a good idea of what reincarnation means, because how can we say there is evidence for reincarnation if we haven't defined it, right?
Correct.
If we don't know what we're talking about, and so I start there. What the data tells me, whether the case data tells me, is that reincarnation is basically a human thing. It's a species thing. I do think animals reincarnate, but in their own species lines. Humans are animals too, of course. We are,
Yeah.
and we reincarnate in our species lines as humans. And so that's number one, and that separates the research from the Eastern religions, which do see this transmigration, right? I so the way I understand it working is a stream of consciousness. I take this dualistic or interactive. It's not. I prefer a more process rather than a Cartesian sort of dualist point of view on this. But at any rate, that there's an interaction between the spirit. I don't like to say soul, but spirit or consciousness, mind, and the brain and the body. The two interact, and so at bodily death, consciousness just continues on. And if we look at apparitions, if we look at mediumship, if we look at all these other areas in survival, we see the continuation of personal identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's because the consciousness just continues on, and it becomes then affiliated with a new body later. And I think effectively that means it possesses the body, right? And so I
Yeah.
think of reincarnation as a type of possession. Right. And it's not a possession like a mediumistic possession or a demonic possession, but it's still a possession of the body, right? It's still consciousness interacting and taking possession of the body. That's how I understand reincarnation.
Excellent. And I'm glad you said that about the possession, because I've been pondering on that for quite some time. And I had this conversation with somebody else I interviewed previously where I said this question, and I wonder if you've ever had this question before. Imagine that reincarnation wasn't a thing, right? And me as a person, I die, and my spirit then just dissolves into nothingness. Let's just go down that road.
Okay.
Would the next human that I would have gone into, would that become a person? So that if you take my train of thought here, if I do reincarnate into it, I'm taking over the entity that would have initially been there. Do you know what I mean? So I'm like suppressing down a spirit, shall we say, that's already going to be naturally evolved into that body. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the question sort of makes sense, but that's not how I see it. I don't think that a spirit is created with conception. I don't think a spirit is necessarily there at conception.
Okay.
I think the body can survive, in the mother can sustain the body before the consciousness arrives. And in many cases, yes, the consciousness does seem to be present, hanging around the body at conception. In other cases, we have many cases. We reincarnation researchers in general, including Stevenson, have many cases with intermissions. That's what the term we use, from birth,
Mm-hmm.
from death to birth. Stevenson used that term, and I do too. Everybody does. That's the intermission, the period between death and birth, of less than 9 months, right? Of intermissions of less than 9 months, which means that the person died, shortly before the person was born. So gestation is already underway then. And so the question arises, is it replacing, another spirit?
Correct.
in the womb, or is it not? And there's so many of these cases, and in some societies, like the Druze of Lebanon, that's where he studied. They're also in Syria, and some in Israel, and some in Jordan. But in that area, Stevenson worked in Lebanon, and so did Erland Harrelson, who followed him. Um, uh, the largest Jewish community. Well, they're very large ones in Syria too, but in that area, um, they believe that um, that reincarnation occurs immediately upon death into the body of a child then being born. So they have no intermission period there. They just have,
Mm.
this is their ideology. This is their belief, right? When you look at their cases, it's longer than that. Stevenson didn't find any that actually matched up to that. But when he looked at the intermissions, the intermission lengths of many, many Druze cases are under 9 months. In fact, the median is only 8 months.
Interesting.
So there are many, many, and it's just hard for me to imagine that when you have that many cases with intermissions under 9 months, that they're all replacing something. So I think that probably the mother's body can sustain until birth.
So essentially, humans are empty vessels until taken over, so to speak. We
Yeah,
become the
exactly.
driver.
Right. I think that's the way I understand it. I don't. That's the only thing of the data. That's what the data leads me to. Yeah.
Now we're going to get into the big, deep questions on pondering stuff later, but let's get straight down to the basics of it. Um, how do we know that reincarnation is a thing? What
Well,
is the stories that drove reincarnation as a topic, do you think?
um, well, what? Okay, there's two different questions, I think. I mean, how do we? Well, but they're very closely related. Let me start with sort of the second one, and that is, at least I will interpret it this way to
Mm-hmm.
mean, and correct me if this is not what you mean, but how did the idea of reincarnation get started?
Or how did it come about? So how did it become into the consciousness of us? How would we know about reincarnation? Where did that idea come from?
Well, that's what you see when you say where did the idea come from. That takes us way, way back in history. I think the idea came from originally from the observation of the same sorts of things that are studied today. That is children's memories, but not only that, children's behaviors. Um, Birthmarks and birth defects, which I'll introduce now. I'm sure we'll talk about more later.
Mm-hmm.
That are used, and remember, I'm an anthropologist, right?
Okay.
That are used in indigenous cultures all over the world to identify a newborn child as the reincarnation, because reincarnation beliefs they didn't start in India. They're much, much older than that. We find them in these tribal societies all over the world. And these societies use these signs like the birthmarks, sometimes dreams also, um, behaviors of a child in an infancy, like not wanting to suckle from his mother, prefer, it signals to them that maybe the mother was his sister or something like that. Somebody that you're not, they take things like that, these clues, these signs. And I think it's that. I think it's those signs which then suggested the idea. And if I'm right about that, then reincarnation could be a very, very, very old idea, because because I mean, when did I mean, probably goes back before Homo sapiens, right? We have
Yeah,
no
more than
idea how.
likely. I just wondered if you come across what's the earliest piece of written or oral that we know of that we can almost date.
Oh, okay. That question of it. Yeah, historically, the oldest accounts that we have been found are Chinese, from um, 5th or 6th century BC, around in there. Um, Now, there are even earlier accounts of beliefs, like Pythagoras, for instance. Pythagoras believed he remembered a past life,
No,
and
I've not heard
that
that
would have
before.
been around, yeah, that would have been. Unfortunately, there are different accounts of it. They're slightly different. I mean, he claimed to have recognized a sword of somebody who is that is written about in the Iliad, I believe, and so several centuries before him, but he felt he was the reincarnation of him and recognized his sword. But different accounts give different places that he recognized this. So, like
Mm.
everything to do with Pythagoras, is sort of, but there is this story there, and that is roughly contemporary with the early Chinese cases, but it's not as documented in an account of these early Chinese ones. The early Chinese ones were much more detailed, and they have the same features as the cases that Stevenson studies, right?
Mm.
The past life memory claims, the behaviors, the recognitions, like of Pythagoras claimed, and birthmarks and so forth. And so the same things that we see in these tribal societies, and yeah, I mean, we study the tribal societies today, but I don't think it's too much of a jump to infer that these beliefs of theirs are very long standing, right? And
Yeah.
that these practices of using these signs to identify a newborn child with some ancestor go way back in their cultures. So, it seems like it's a very, very old idea. But yeah, the earliest accounts are these Chinese ones. And then we began finding them in India and up through the 19th century.
Yeah,
Um,
no, so I agree with you. Obviously, that all that suggests it's a really, really ancient thing. It's
yeah.
just obviously it's not in the contemporary age where we've had literature. We could say, oh, that's recent. It's really old, and we'll go back into
Yeah, I
antiquity.
know. And
Yeah.
this is really an interesting thing, though, because um, even though as we move into the 20th century, early 20, now Stevenson started his research in 1961. As we move into the 20th century, in the first decades of the 20th century, we find some reports from Europe. And yet, um, this was not an interest of the Society for Psychical Research. So it was not a psychical research thing. Mediumship was, apparitions was. There was great skepticism about reincarnation in Stevenson's work. Um, Even though there were accounts beginning to come up. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of the resistance, I think, had to do with even within psychical research parapsychology, the resistance was there for a long time, was because these cases weren't really, investigated. In fact, let me tell you something.
Hmm.
When I was at the ASPR, um, I found I was there as librarian and archivist, and I found in the archives there um, that Walter Franklin Prince, who was one of the directors from earlier in the 20th century, in the 1920s, had been sent a paper by an Indian researcher
Okay.
about three cases, and he rejected it for publication. He was too skeptical of it. He had never heard of things like this. He rejected it. It was later published in the French Revue Métaphysique. It was published, but in French, and so so things like that happened, right? Where English speakers rejected this because they couldn't,
They couldn't
you know,
understand
they
it
make
really.
sense of they couldn't make
Yeah.
sense of it. They couldn't study it themselves. They'd never heard of it before, and so it just seemed questionable, right?
Mm.
If not, maybe fraudulent. And so, yeah, he rejected it, and the guy had to publish it in French instead. But the earliest investigated cases were actually investigated in India in the 1920s, and this was one set of them.
Excellent.
And
Now that leads us into who remembers past lives and therefore can obviously add evidence to the reincarnation theory or topic. So my question on it is, why is it that it's young people that remember past lives, and where does that
well,
cut off hit?
Right. Well, let me. This is another important thing because adults also can remember. Um, and the there's okay. So coming back to the children, and then I'll get on to the adults. Say
Hmm.
more about them. Um, the so yes, in Stevenson's cases in particular, it's mainly young children. Um, and it can be very young children as early as they start to talk, age 1, 2 are already coming out with these things. Um, and then most of them, by late childhood, have the memories have faded and they've forgotten. But there have been studies done, um, of past life memory retention, that show in some societies, the Druze among them, that a good number of these children continue to remember things into adulthood. So it's not like there is this absolute cutoff.
Mm.
Um, and then we find that the memories can come originally in adulthood too. Um, that there is some trigger or something, some cue that brings them out. Um, when we look at adult cases, we often find that there were behaviors. Once we can identify the previous person in the adult case, we know who the person was. We can then go back and we can identify behaviors in childhood, right, that
Yeah,
match the previous person. But you didn't know that until the memories, right? And you were
of
able to
course. Yeah.
identify the person, and so, so that sort of, there is that sort of thing with many adult cases too. I think that there is mainly there's a strong developmental thing here. I think with early the very young children, uh, the brain's control over consciousness isn't what it will become later.
Oh, I see.
I think that's what it amounts to, and so the memories have an easier time floating up, because when we see with older children and particularly with adults, different kinds of altered states become much more important. Um, Children do have dreams, past life memory dreams. They also have many memories in the waking state. With adults, few memories in the waking state, predominantly in dreams, but they can also occur in other kinds of altered states too. Sometimes drug states, sometimes hypnosis, although this research is not about hypnosis, and we can talk more about hypnosis and the problems with it, because not because there are a lot of problems with it. Okay, but
Yeah.
there are some cases where the memories do arise that way legitimately. Um, or in hypnagogic, hypnopompic states, going in, coming out of sleep, that type of thing. Um, play much bigger role with adults than they do with kids. Again, coming back, I think, to developmental factors. So I think that's the answer.
What percentage would you put on it of, obviously there's billions of people in the world, right? But what percentage of children are reporting past memories of previous lives? Are we talking like 0.000, that really small amount?
Yeah, we don't really have a good handle on this yet. Um, there's been only one good survey, and it was an on the ground survey in the 1970s, that long ago, in northern India. And it found an incidence of estimated, I mean, it estimated incidence of 2.8 per thousand people in this particular area of
Yeah.
India. Now, that happens, northern India is one of the regions of the world where these cases are particularly common. Um, we don't really know. I mean, there's some other areas, Druze, I keep coming back to the Druze because Stevenson wrote that they're particularly common there. Um, and others have found the same thing. There have been a lot of anthropological stuff about the Druze too. Other people have written about them. The Druze do seem to have an awful lot of these cases, but we don't have surveys yet, and so we can't put a number on it. We can't quantify it. We really do need more of these surveys, particularly in the West. My guess is, though, in the West, because I have a Facebook group called Science of Reincarnation.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody's on Facebook and wants to join us, you're absolutely welcome
I
to.
will link it in the description to this video, so go and have a look at that.
Okay. Um, because in that, and we have a large group now. We're up over 180,000 people, members. And so a lot of people come in and talk about their memories as adults, or their children or grandchildren who have these memories. Now, most of the time, the memories, I call them memories, but they really should just be called visions because we can't confirm them, right? But
Yeah.
they have all the characteristics of memories of confirmed memories in these cases, right? So they fit all the patterns of the memories. So we sort of call them memories, but we have to be careful about that. However, the striking thing is that these are much, much, much more common, apparently, than we ever realized. And I think that, or didn't realize before social media, because social media is now making it possible for people to share these. And as people share them and see them, they come in and say, oh, I had this experience too. And it just snowballs, And so I really don't know. I mean, I think it's probably many more people than we realize, but but it may also vary by culture. It does seem to vary by culture, and not just because certain societies suppress them, but there seems to be a natural variation there, and we don't really know all the answers to that, why that should be.
Yeah, I'm thinking along those lines as well. Obviously, India is a big region for this topic, and obviously it's well ingrained in their culture and it's well believed, isn't it? So whether that plays a part or not. Now, the reason I was asking about the scope is which would lead me to the next question, which is if we've got loads of stories from children saying they remember past lives, and then we've got the adults coming in as well, does it or can we extrapolate out from this that every single person on the planet is going through this reincarnation process, but only a small number of them are remembering?
Yeah,
Do you
I
think that's
think
where it is?
I do. I do think that's where it is. I partly because as human beings, we're also similar. And it's hard for me to understand how some of us then could be reincarnated and others not. I just think that we all probably are. And it's just that most of us don't have these memories. I think that we don't have them because we have subconscious things going on that keep them from coming up. There, people who really have these memories will tell you they're very difficult to deal with, particularly in adulthood. It's much easier, it seems, for children to process them, although it can be difficult for the kids too, and for their families to deal with these things. And they have to deal with them for years before they
Mm.
fade. And when they come up in adulthood, they can be much longer lasting and have much more, of an effect there. So I I think probably that we have subconscious blocks to remembering, and that we allow ourselves to remember when we need to. If it's an issue that really that we need conscious help to resolve, um, then it'll come up. But otherwise, it'll stay down. And I think that's also, why the regressions tend not to be so good, because with regressions, you're going in there and you're trying to evoke them. You're trying to get at them. And I think the subconscious doesn't like that. If the subconscious is ready to let them go, they'll come up naturally. If you try to get at this stuff, the subconscious will react. It'll give you stuff, but it'll make stuff up. It'll distort things. And this is what we see when we study the regressions. We see a lot of distortions. Yeah, let me just explain then on the recording that I've taken off my glasses because I wear bifocals. Otherwise, be in it's right on the line where I have to look at. And otherwise, there's going to be a jolt between seeing me with the glasses and seeing me without it, if I didn't
Yeah,
explain
I
so.
understand.
At any rate, so what I was talking about is my belief. When I ask myself, how did reincarnation start? It seems to me logically that it must have started when life started, right? As soon as there was the death of the body, there was the survival of consciousness. Now, what that means, though, what that implies is just as physical form has evolved, right? Humans haven't been there from the very beginning. We evolved from, earlier hominids, or they evolved from earlier mammals and so forth, all the way back. So obviously our physical form has evolved. I think our consciousness has also. So I'm not saying that the consciousness we know today is the same consciousness of, let's say, an amoeba. But it's just that amoebas, I think, also, maybe we're not conscious in the same way we are, but but possessed consciousness, right? And do. I mean, they're still around, right? So, but I think consciousness has evolved along with physical form, and I think that, and the reason for that is consciousness has to work with the brain, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if, as the brain evolves, consciousness needs to evolve to work with the brain, right? And I think that is why we don't see transmigration across species, because the consciousness is not interoperable with the species. If species are close enough, and my rule tends to be, if to successfully interbreed, okay, then their consciousness is probably close enough to be interoperable, right? So it's not as if, because the question comes up, okay, what happens when species die out? Does their consciousness just end? Maybe, or maybe, it's close enough to another species that reincarnation begins in that species, So there's all these questions that we still have to resolve in all of this, but that's my basic idea.
I know, because this leads into an obvious question that you'd ask, which is, if the human species is from this planet, where is the consciousness from? Is it from this planet? Is it from a different dimension? And when
Yeah,
did they first come together?
right. I'm not really big on either multiple dimensions or, multi worlds. I those are physical ideas. They're out there. Some people push them. Um, I follow a different strain of physics, of quantum physics, that doesn't buy into all of that. It seems to me that those ideas were developed by physicists who could not accept that consciousness had something to do with quantum dynamics, quantum mechanics. Because early on in the history of quantum mechanics, there was the realization that the way things work out really only makes sense if consciousness somehow is engaged in them and brings the equations somehow to a close. Because at a quantum level, it turns out everything is just like a probabilistic soup. And so something has to happen to terminate these quantum equations at the right times to create our physical reality, right? And so for some people early on, that can only come about through consciousness. And so, but there's some people who just can't buy that, right? Materialists just can't buy that. So they went off and developed these other ideas of many worlds, parallel universes, and all of this. And but those who are comfortable with consciousness being involved here, like Henry Stapp, people can look up that, STAPP. He's the quantum physicist that I like best, and he has in fact written that personality survival of death is not incompatible with quantum physics, and he's gone even further and said that reincarnation is not. That he can allow for reincarnation just with minor tweaks to the equations of quantum mechanics. So that has to do with that. I mean, the idea that we came from other planets. Well, we've looked for a very long time now, or many decades. I guess it hasn't been all that long, and we've not found life anywhere else. And so that's another, just maybe a theoretical, hypothetical possibility. Some people are convinced that there must be life on other worlds, and we must be visited by other intelligences. But we have no proof of that yet. And so it's all just a big hypothetical. So if you want to buy into those hypotheticals, no, okay, go ahead. You're not going to agree with me. But I prefer to stay with as close as I can to hard data. And I don't see the hard data that tells me that there's any sort of life elsewhere in the universe. And so I don't see why we even need to consider the possibility of other worlds. But even if we do, if I'm right about consciousness needing to interface with the brain, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm right that you can't have transmigration between species that are too different. It makes very little sense to me to imagine how an off-Earth alien life form is going to be able to reincarnate in a human body. It just doesn't make sense. If we can't even, if we can't even transmigrate between earthly, animal species, how on earth are we going to be able to with an unearthly origin? So yeah, so that those are the reasons that I'm really skeptical about
Sure. So where do you think consciousness sits then? If we are the brain and the vehicle, so to speak, and this me dies, where does this consciousness go or sit to then go into the new person? Have you thought about that? Where does the evidence lead you?
Yeah. The evidence leads me to think that it's not a place. I mean, we talk about heaven, and all of this.
Mm-hmm.
The evidence leads me to think it's a state of mind. And that's all. It's just a change in a state of mind. And the reason I say it's, one of these studies that I've done is between looking at the memories of the intermission period, and there are, and about 20%, a lot of them, a fifth of the cases of children who recall previous lives that are verified.
Mm-hmm.
They also remember or say they remember things that happened between their death and rebirth. And we find these in Asia and we find them in the West. And they're very similar in some ways. They're also structurally very similar to near-death experiences in that you have the same sort of thing. In a near-death experience, obviously you're going back to your body, but in the in reincarnation experiences, the body ends and you go on. But in both experiences, you have the same sorts of spirit entities getting involved. So, like in near-death experiences, there'll be either spirit entities or spirits of relatives, some sort of spirit, either non-human spirits or spirits of relatives who say your time hasn't come, go back, right?
Yeah.
In the reincarnation experiences, these same figures say, come with me, and lead them on. And there are other aspects of the NDEs and intermission experiences that found very similar. So when you look though at the intermission experiences of the Asians versus Westerners, you see a very strongly significant difference between the way that they understand the intermission state to be, right? So in the West, they all talk about it being in heaven, right? They go up somewhere to heaven. I mean, that's what we imagine. We're going to go to heaven, right? And there's this place somehow up here. In Asia, they don't have that idea. That's basically, it's a religious idea, really. They don't have that religion idea. There's a religious idea out there. What they talk about during the intermission is staying on the earthly plane and in a realistic place, like hanging out in a tree or in a conch shell in one case, or in a field, right? And from that vantage point, and they see things, just like in near-death experiences, people talk about seeing, going out of their body and looking things in the operating room or the accident site or what have you. They will talk about seeing things during the intermission, probably through the use of clairvoyance, right? How else would it be?
Yeah.
right? So, so you again, both in both NDEs and in reincarnation, in these intermission experiences, you have the use of these of psychic abilities now that have taken over when you're in this discarnate state. Um, so yeah, so they see these things and they're veridical. I mean, they say they saw things which living people confirm actually did happen, right? So it seems to me that the consciousness, so consciousness just does continue, right?
Yep.
Um, and but in these Asian cases, because they hang out in a realistic place, like in one of Stevenson's cases, a child said that after he died, he stayed in in a people tree, a Peepal people a tree in the courtyard of his former family, right? And he stayed there for quite a number of years, and during that time, he saw other children born in the family. He named them. He saw other things going on. Once he followed one of his brothers when he left the house at night, which he wasn't supposed to do alone, told his mother about this in a dream. The mother remembered having the dream. It gets really crazy,
Hmm.
okay, on some of this stuff. Um, and then there's another case where a boy said, well, after he died, he stayed in the field for a while where he was killed, and then he decided to try to find his way back home. He went and he got lost in the local market, but his present birth father came along. For some reason, he was attracted to his father. He followed him home on the bus. It turns out his father did go to the market at that time, did take a bus home. I mean, it's just like this stuff's nuts. But but you see the difference here. In the Asian cases, they're talking about realistic terrestrial setting. They're talking about being right around us and interacting with us, in these ways. We can't see them; they can see us. Um, and so that it just, I think it's just a state of mind. I mean, I think heaven is a state of mind. I think that these other things are also a state of mind. I think so what happens to us after death, I think, is very, very much conditioned by what we expect to happen.
That's what I was going to say. We're building what we believe then,
Right.
in
And
essence.
exactly. And doesn't this make sense? If our consciousness just survives death, that it would continue, it would carry with it the beliefs that we had in life.
Yeah. So in this Asian model, let's call it that, there could be millions stroke billions of consciousnesses just floating about all over the place. So you go to the park, there could be 100,000 there. That's an example. And then what are they doing? Waiting for somebody to be born and then all rush in? Is it a race to the embryo? Is it what does the data suggest there? What's the step between
Yeah,
floating about to then getting in the body?
right. Yeah. Well, interestingly, um, there are, well, in a lot of these cases, like I give you the example of the boy who found his father in the market. The the intermission memories um, describe the way that they found the new parents, right? So it's um, it can be something chance like that. There's another case. This wasn't the Stevenson case, but this is one of the early 1920s Indian cases, um, where a body, it was cholera or smallpox or something like that, that caused the death, and the people did not want to handle the body. They didn't want to bury it, cremate it, or anything. They threw it
Sure,
in the
sure.
river. They threw it in the river. Um, the mother was happened to be bathing downstream at that time.
Not good.
Well, but he's
Oh, I see
what?
what you
Yeah,
mean. Not the mother of the dead one. You mean the mother of a new one.
the mother of the where he was reborn. So it's
Yes.
like the spirit floated down the river. The body would have too, obviously, but
Yeah.
the important thing here is the spirit floated down the river and found its mother that way. So you have Stevenson called this sort of thing a geographical factor. So that he saw that in a lot of these cases. The other kind of factor he called a psychological factor. And the psychological factor is where people are drawn to somebody because for some reason, for some reason. And psychological factors are particularly important in family cases, because there are a lot of family cases or acquaintance cases where people knew that person, and so you assume that there was this emotional linkage, right? That was the
Yeah.
factor there. So those two things are the biggest things: the geographical factor and the psychological factor. Um, and so it doesn't seem random, right? It does not seem random. It doesn't seem like karma or any other force is what's bringing people together. Um, you know, now my daughter, interestingly, well, this may be, and it's hard. I don't know how to interpret this quite. When she was 3, um, she was one of these children who talked about having these memories, and she told her mother and me once that she had seen us. And at the time, I mean, I wish I'd asked her, when did you see us? How? And because I think she was talking about seeing us, in a sort of an intermission thing. But what she said then is, I saw you were looking for a baby
Oh, wow.
and I came to you. That's how she put it. So that sort of signals that, okay, at conception, there's some signal, something going up from the mother saying, okay, I'm ready.
Mm.
And that somehow, we don't know how, but somehow that's made. Now, the other thing with my daughter is that she talked about having been on a pink farm, and everything was pink. The fence, the perimeter fence was pink. The buildings were all painted pink. And the crazy thing about that is, about a year or so before she was conceived, so long before she was, close to a couple of years before she was born, we were driving up an interstate in the States, and we passed this pink farm. And it was so striking. I mean, how often do you see?
You don't see pink farms, yeah.
You don't see pink farms, right? Everything pink, pink. All the buildings pink, the fence pink. And it was so striking. We talked about it, probably for weeks to everybody. We talked about it. So maybe us seeing that pink farm and making such an impression on us, maybe that's somehow connected to her psychically. And so there was this psychic linkage that was set up there.
Yeah, you were like a beacon maybe, and then
We were like a beacon,
attached to
right?
it, yeah.
Right. So something like this may be what's going on there. We don't have the answers to that yet, And so, but yeah, I mean, you do, but it's clearly not random. It's clearly is not a random thing.
See, now, you as a researcher of reincarnation, then your daughter says this stuff.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, it's stuck with you because you've just told me about it. I would have really, if I was a researcher, and I don't have a child, by the way, but if I did have a daughter that said that, you'd want to just keep questioning him, wouldn't you? Come on, tell me more, tell me more. Did you get any more out of her on anything?
I didn't. Okay. This is a really good question. At this point, she was born in 2001. Remember, I had been studying this since 1980. So I was in a way prepared for it. And I remember my study of cases tells me that it's probably just as well that most of us don't remember past lives. That when they come up for a reason. And so I discourage asking children a lot of questions, because I don't want to bring the memories out. If they talk about them, I'll write them down. I'll study them. I'll support them. And we both, her mother and I both let her know, that we believed her, that we were interested, and she would come out, every few weeks she would come to me and say, I want to tell you a story about myself and come out. That's how she would always preface it.
Lovely.
And it come out with another memory to do with this life. And I did ask her questions sometimes, but only when she had brought up the subject first. And sometimes I got sensible replies, other times I didn't. And what that taught me is that, and I've since worked with other kids. I started off doing sort of book analysis, and now I study cases. So I've studied kids since then, and there are two types with young kids. There are two responses that they can have. One is that they will, because they want to respond to you. They want, so they'll either get frustrated because they don't know the answers, or they'll make something up. Now, older children will tell you simply, I don't know. But younger children want
They want the interaction, don't they?
Yeah. They either they want the interaction or they want to please you in some way. They don't want to, and so you get one of those. So I don't encourage asking children about memories. Do listen to them. Do write them down, because you'll forget, and they may very well forget, but they may be interested later. Do write them down. Do document them. And it's okay if they bring the subject up to ask a few questions. Don't be surprised, if you don't get sensible answers to them. The most reliable things are things that they come up on their own. They just come out spontaneously, and they come and tell you about.
Sure. So have you got another little quip that she mentioned to you that you thought, oh, that was interesting, and you proved it? Or was it just the pink farm, which was the best one regarding your
The
daughter?
pink farm is the best one, and we never went back there, unfortunately. But I'll tell you this: the next time we drove that way, the farm was no longer pink.
Oh, that's naughty. Especially if you took your daughter with you. That would have been an interesting thing to see how she reacted.
To see. And I told her about that. Now, when she was 11, I didn't, because she stopped talking about it after a few months, and I just let it drop. I thought it's fading, and now at 11, she's stable enough, and I asked her again because I was working on one of my books, and I was curious. I asked her whether she still remembered anything, and she did. Now, a year later, she no longer did. But I told her at that point that it was, and her reaction was, and she was sad, really, and almost hurt in a way. How did she put it exactly? I wish they had, well, I'll paraphrase this. It was something like, I'm sad that they didn't follow my wishes, was basically her sense of what she said. After she died. So, but we never went back there, and it was sort of out of the way, and we never had the time to do it. Had we probably would have been able to learn more things.
Yeah.
Now the farm is gone altogether. It's now a campground, one of these KOA Campgrounds of America campground. One of these, now it's like totally gone. But probably if I went back there, I could get records, and I think about it sometimes, but I just never have. Yeah. Am I answering your question?
No, that's fine. The side journey from here would be the where you mentioned the making stuff up or silly answers. Did you still write those down on the off chance that they could have become true later on, sort of thing? Or,
I did. I mean, in one of them was, she told me that her body was buried on the farm with the help of the farm animals, things like this, things a 3-year-old might say.
Yeah.
Just, but maybe the body was buried on the farm. Maybe there were animals hanging. Maybe the animals were hanging around. I mean, you just don't, you just really don't know. But it sounded a little bit fanciful. It really just didn't sound. And I told Jim Tucker, about this, and that was his response. Well, this just doesn't sound, realistic,
Yeah.
So, um,
Well,
uh,
that leads us then into the next question, which will be, what is the best evidence you believe, or best case, shall we say, that you've come across that you can recount to us to say, right, this is what somebody said, this is what we found?
right. Well, I'll describe a good one, but let me
Hmm.
preface this by saying I don't think any one case is decisive. I think it's the pattern across all of the cases.
Makes
I think
sense.
it's looking at all the cases together. But I'll describe one that I studied that was particularly interesting. Um, American girl called Rylan O'Banion. Um, you know, Irish name, obviously,
Hmm.
and and Rylan, it comes from Ryland, So the um, she was her first months she was an ideal child, and then she became a problem child by her first birthday. Um, she started sleepwalking. Um, and this was like every night or 5 nights a week, and she would go and get in bed with her mother. Um, and if she would put back in her own bed, same thing would happen. She would wake up, and just sleepwalk. Um, and then over the next couple of years, as she got a little bit older, she started complaining about her shirts, um, her tags. She wanted tags cut out of her shirts. They said they were hurting her neck and all of this. She said it felt like her skin was burning. Um, and this became, even when she started school, at least kindergarten, getting out of the home, this would continue, and it was really a big thing. But there's nothing for the family to make any sense of this. We didn't know what had happened to her. She just then when she's 3, so I guess in the middle of this somewhere, um, her mother is reading her a good night story. She finished the story. She just turned off the light. I haven't reviewed this in a while. I'm getting mixed up.
No worries.
Um, so let me see. No, the next thing that happened earlier, is her mother um, um, decided to take some pictures of the family. Had a professional photographer come in, did pictures of the family all around. And there was one of Rylan out in their yard, and she's looking at something. You can't see what she's looking at because the picture is of her, right? And her face is just totally ashen, and she's obviously seen something, right? Um, so her mother took the prints and put them in little frames and put them around. She took that one to her office. Whenever Rylan at 3 came to her office and saw that picture, she would say to her mother, I was bigger then. I was bigger in that picture. And her mother would like argue, what do you mean you were bigger? That didn't make any sense, right?
Mm.
And so she would do this again and again and again. Like I say, every time she came to the office. And this went on for a while. And so she's 6 at the time when her mother is reading the story, not 3. She's
Okay.
6 when this next thing happens. So all these years, she's been complaining about, you know, her shirt and, and that wanting the tags cut out and all of this, nobody knowing what is going on. So her mother just turns off the light and she says to her, do you remember when I was bigger in that picture? And her mother starts in this again. Doesn't make any sense. What does this mean? And she says, I died. Um, and she said, at that point, she said that I was in our yard. She said, in our yard. And I was hit by lightning. And that's how she understood it at the time.
Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, now, Yes, interesting. However, okay, so after that, she starts saying more and more things that she remembers. But it's a couple of years after that. And she's gradually remembering more and more. Like one of the things she remembered the name Jennifer. She remembered that she remembered things about Louisiana, or she thought she did. Um, when her brother asked her where this happened, she said, well, maybe Canada. Um, and when did it happen? Maybe 1971. And she asked her mother when she was born, and her mother was born in 1971. At any rate, and then she comes out with this. I remember a plane crash. These are the clues that her mother needs. She then goes to the internet. She's got 1971. She's got Canada. She's got Louisiana. She's got a plane crash.
And lightning.
And lightning. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So she's got those things. Okay. So she goes to the internet and she looks for a plane crash in 1971. Okay. In Canada, nothing. A plane crash in 1971, nothing. A plane crash in Louisiana, bingo. There was a Pan Am plane that took off from the New Orleans airport in Kenner, not Canada, Kenner, Louisiana, suburb of New Orleans. That's where the airport is. In a thunderstorm, hit a low altitude wind shear, came down less a mile from the end of the runway into a residential neighborhood. Okay, this was like, at the time, this was the third worst aviation history in U.S.
Would have been big news.
Yeah. It was big news at the time, right? And so, there's of course a lot, still, you can find a lot on the internet. And so it was in 1982, 82 or 83. Because so everybody on the plane died. 8 people on the ground did, including a girl called Jennifer, who was born in 1971.
Interesting. Okay. And it all falls into place.
It starts really falling into place. Okay. So when I interviewed Ryland, she was 10, okay, and still remembered a lot of things. And one of the interesting things about this, remember, even though this started very early in her life, it was just gradually improving. Gradually, things were becoming clearer for her, right? And so when I interviewed her at 10, she told me something that she'd only recently told her mother, and then added some things that she had never told her before. At that point, she said she wasn't in her yard. She was in the carport of her home. She was talking on the telephone and saw the plane come towards her. Okay. So she says, this is in 1982 or 83. She's on the telephone in the carport. And back then we didn't have cell phones that, it would have been on one of these long lines.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. Running out of the kitchen door. So the kitchen door went into the carport. The cord comes out of it. It's what you have to imagine. Sitting on a swing in a carport. Now, a swing in a carport. I'd never heard of a swing in a carport. And I said, well, was it a porch swing? Was it a swing in the yard? No, it was a swing in the carport. Quite definite about this at 10. Okay. So after interviewing her, I went to Kenner, right, to interview people there. That's what you do in these cases. You start with the person who has the memories, and then you go back to the previous life and see how much you can. And so that's not so long ago that there are not still a lot of people around, right?
Yeah.
And so I interviewed her friends at the time, um, um, and I also got hold of her autopsy report, which is public in Louisiana. So I was able to get Jennifer's autopsy report, because the friends didn't know what had happened to her body. Nobody knew exactly what had happened to her. You have to imagine this. The plane is coming in. The plane took out 12 houses on 3 streets. The first house it hit was Jennifer's. So Jennifer is sitting, as it turns out, she was right, on a swing in the carport. And she's seeing this plane comes towards her. So the house was like totally, her mother and her sister did escape, but the house was on fire. They were in flames. They rushed across the road. Her sister was scarred for life because of the fire burns, and Jennifer was killed. But because of the house was being totally demolished, and particularly that side of the house where the carpet was being totally demolished, and there being such a big debris area to clean up and to go through, her body wasn't found till 3 days later. 3 days is a long time for news, right? News stories have moved on. They've moved on to the next story. So all of the news stories at the time didn't talk about Jennifer's body, and none of them picked it up later when her body was found. So nobody knew what had happened to Jennifer. And I was hearing all these different ideas. So I got hold of her death certificate. The death certificate I couldn't see, but the autopsy report was the critical thing here. The autopsy report said her body was recovered from the floor of the carport.
Okay.
There was no sign of smoke inhalation. There was no discoloration of the blood. So she was dead by the time the plane hit her. Now, another thing which I determined, and I could see, there are electrical lines running right in front of the house. And I talked to, I think I talked to a medical person. He may have been the person who did the autopsy, actually, who told me that in 1981 or 82, that the power lines were not insulated in this area. Okay. The telephone lines ran just a few feet under the power lines. Now, for the plane, and this was right in front of, on the same side of the block and right in front of the house, and the plane coming right in would have had to slice through those. In fact, I have a picture that was taken by a neighbor across the street, and you can see, that they've dropped down, that you can't see these lines anymore. So the plane would have had to slice through those. It did. It obviously did. And if an uninsulated power line came into contact with a telephone line, it could have sent a surge up the telephone line, because the other thing that Ryland said, so she's sitting, so she said, this is at 10. This isn't what she said originally, where she thought she was in the yard and she's hit by a strike of lightning. What she said at 10 was that she was sitting on her carport talking on the telephone, and she got electrocuted over the telephone line.
That's amazing. Well,
Isn't that
not in
amazing?
a good way either. Yeah.
Yeah, not in a good way, but everything makes sense now. Everything makes sense. And but nobody knew this. Nobody knew it. It was not written anywhere except for this autopsy report. None of her friends knew it. It was not in the news. And I read all the news stories about this whole thing. Nobody knew this. How could she have known it? Because one of the things we run into is that people say, "Oh, people, it's all ESP. People are getting this information clairvoyantly or telepathically from other people. It's not a memory, But here, there isn't any way there's nothing she could have gotten it from unless it was this autopsy report. And then she would have had to put that together with other facts.
Yeah, it's too much, and there was no internet
It's just
around at
too
that
much.
time specifically.
Right.
So
There
yeah,
wasn't. That's what there really wasn't. And when she's coming up with this stuff, okay, by 10, she's old enough to have gone to the internet alone and found some things, but there wasn't this to find. It wasn't there. I mean, there wasn't, nothing would have told her this. So this is why I like to talk about this case as a strong case, because there really isn't any other way to explain this, at least to me, other than the memory coming to her.
no, and I'm with you on that. And I also must thank God for that lass on the phone to see a plane coming at you and thinking,
Yeah. Oh my
who was on the
God.
phone?
Yeah.
Do we know who was on the phone? And did they?
No, no. And we've never been able to figure that out. And that would be great to know.
Wouldn't it?
Um, yeah. Now the most likely thing is that it was a boy
Mm.
who has moved away. Um, but we nobody knows how to get in touch with him, and he hasn't come forward, and we just don't know. Oh, no, one other thing that I have to say. So in walking around this neighborhood, and that house had been reconstructed, it had to be, obviously, and there's no, I mean, a new house was built in that place. But walking around the neighborhood, there was another house just a block away, block and a half at most, that had a carport, a swing in the carport.
Similar
Just
model of house, then, yeah.
exactly what she described, a swing and a carport.
More corroboration.
More corroboration. I mean, it's just like, and I keep telling the story, and I always say, have you ever heard of a swing? Nobody has heard of a swing in a carport unless they live in this area, where some of the houses, they were all built at the same time, had swings. Some of them had swings and carports, but outside of that area, nobody's ever heard of a
Mm.
swing in a carport. But sure enough, it was there, right? So it's just, so how do you, I just, I can't get to any other answer than memory.
No, and I'm with you. And also, if you go back to that ashen face photo,
Oh,
that must have
okay.
been mid memory where she's thinking, "Oh Christ,
Okay.
that happened."
Yeah, okay. With this too, this is another thing. When so when I was there, when I was in Kenner, I took a picture with my phone and then sent it to her mother, Ryland's mother. What Ryland would have seen from the carport.
Hmm.
When her mother saw that picture, she had an aha moment. And she then went out in her yard, sent me a picture of what Ryland would have been looking at when that picture was taken. The configuration of trees and of a pole that would have been very similar to the electrical pole that Ryland would have seen was very similar to Jennifer would have seen when she died, was very similar to what Ryland was looking at when that picture was taken.
So it evokes the memory, brings it up, blah
Right.
blah blah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Right.
that's quality. That one, isn't it? That's a really good story. And yes, you're right. I don't think you can come to any other conclusion, really.
Really. I mean, you
Mm.
just really have to work at it, and then, you know, that's even what you would come up with is even harder to believe than reincarnation in the end, right?
Of course. And why would you want to rip it apart for no real reason other than prove your weird theory,
Yeah,
which you'd
that's
have to
right.
stretch to fit? And I know there's going to be a shed load more cases than that, and I don't think we've got massive amount to go through them. But if we have at the end, we can touch on some more. But I do want to jump into the birthmarks and birth defects topic.
Okay.
So, how do these play into the reincarnation story?
Yeah, I mean, they're very important, actually. Uh, so let me start with at the end, the question
Okay.
that everybody has about this and explain how they happen. And then I'll go into more detail about them because there's a lot of things to say about them. But that this will be the question that everybody has in their mind, right? So let me get it out of the way first. Um, I think they're psychogenic. I think it's as simple as that. I think the reincarnating mind carries with it that is part of the self-identity, and it brings it, maybe not consciously, usually probably not consciously, but unconsciously brings that part of the identity along with the possession of the body, and then imprints the new body with them. So that it's the incoming consciousness that is producing them, again through psychokinesis. And there again, I mean, it's not all that far-fetched. We know that this happens in, say, psychic healing and stigmata, all sorts of different ways. We see the mind affecting the body physically. All right, so to talk about birthmarks then, now that I've said that and made it make sense,
Yes.
framed it in that way. Okay, so there are a lot of these birthmarks have to do with wounds, right? Particularly fatal wounds. Now, not all birthmarks are related to reincarnation. I mean, that's as important. Some of them we know the heredity. Some of them have to do with just accidents. The baby being bumped when it's pulled out of the birth canal. Things like this.
Okay.
So, not all birthmarks are reincarnation related. Those that are, though, tend to be of a couple of types that are relatively unusual. And one of those, and they're the types that you can sort of understand how PK might be able to be involved with it, because some of the red and brown birthmarks are produced by a concentration of red blood cells, of hemoglobin, right? And that's something that PK could manage to do, right? So at any rate, so the reincarnation birthmarks tend to be of unusual types. They tend to be in unusual places. They tend to have unusual coloring, but they match in placement and in looks, in color and in dimension very often, and like the scars, like the wounds that they commemorate. Okay, so they're really sort of very striking. The other thing to say about them is it's not always wounds. It's not always death wounds anyway, fatal wounds. It can be surgical scars that turn up as birthmarks. It can be earring holes.
Whoa.
It can be tattoo. It can be tattoos.
I would never have thought of that. You'd have thought it would have been the final death slice or whatever.
Right, you would. I mean, this is sort of, but it's not just that. Yes, I mean, that's a large part of it, but it's not just that. Also, we're not just talking about birthmarks. We're also talking about deformities, birth deformities.
Yeah.
And we're talking about internal diseases too, sometimes. So we're talking about a whole range of physical things that have to do with the previous person in some way that get carried over to the new life. And I think the best way to explain all of this is the psychogenic model. Because, besides having to explain this great diversity of physical things carry over, we don't necessarily see them always. I mean, sometimes when you would expect to have a birthmark, that's not there. Again, if the mind has something to do with that, it's easier to explain why, there's not this necessary correspondence between the body and
okay, so can you give me a couple of examples of where we've got a birthmark and we can associate that with a previous life and then prove that?
Well, one of Stevenson's cases from his first collection of 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation was an Indian boy who had his throat slit. And the boy who recalled that there's another thing. I'm getting myself confused here because there's something else I want to get to in connection with this, but had a birthmark, a linear birthmark that went across his throat. And it was sort of unusual also in that it was sort of stippled, like a healed wound would be. Yeah. Anyway, so that's just one example where you asked for one example. That was one example. Sure. What I want to mention with that is another topic, and we can come back to birthmarks, but let me get this in while I'm thinking about it.
Okay.
He also had a phobia, which we see.
That was next on my list anyway. So
was it next on your list anyway? So it's a nice segue here. I chose the right case, didn't I? Okay. So he was killed by a barber and a washerman who were relatives of the family, and the whole point of killing him was to make way for an inheritance, and all, so it was one of
Money.
these,
Yeah.
yeah, money,
Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, he generalized that. He was scared not just of those people, but of all barbers and all washermen. Okay. So his was sort of a generalized phobia, but you get phobias very often in these cases where people are, if they drown, they're scared of water. If they yeah, and the phobias can be of locations, they can be of the instruments that were used to kill them, they can be of people, but some sort of phobia is very common.
Mm. My mum's scared of spiders, and we couldn't find a legitimate reason why. So it makes you think: is it possible? You know?
Yeah. I mean, if it's something that she's had from very early on, and there was nothing that happened to her then that would, if she never got bit by a spider as a kid, yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, that is at that point that we begin to say, well, maybe because that's what we see.
So these death throes and or scars and or phobias are all sort of like trauma events brought through into the new life then, and then
That's right.
thus side out to the flesh, so to speak.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Right. And I think that emotional quality is what it makes them memorable, right? I mean, if we think about the things that we remember, even in our own lives, right, current lives, it's the more emotionally meaningful things, and so it makes sense then that the same types of things would be the most memorable in our new life.
Yeah. So where do the tattoos come in then?
Well, I mean, if this particular, well, there's several of them, but there's one. Um, there was a tattoo that was supposed to have had um, a metaphysical reason. It was, and so it would have been highly significant to the person, right? And so that's why
He brought it with him. Not
he brought it
necessarily
with
some
him.
negative, but more as a
Um,
positive emotion.
right.
Yeah.
Now, when we're talking about this, reminds me of something else, and
Okay.
we haven't gotten too far away from birthmarks. So let me talk about a particular type of birthmark, which, if we haven't weirded out your audience
You're going
completely
to
yet,
say experimental birthmarks, aren't you?
I am going to talk about experimental
That
birthmarks.
was also on the list.
Okay. Yeah, experimental birthmarks are birthmarks that result from cadaver marking. So a dead body is marked, and then and it's marked intentionally with the hope of tracking a person into their next incarnation. And so these birthmarks show up, and sometimes they can be tracked back. Um, and this is a practice that's really very widespread. I mean, in East Asia, it's been reported all the way from Thailand and Burma in the south, all the way up to Mongolia, all the way through
Hmm.
China to Mongolia, and from west to east, from India to Japan, that whole area.
Yeah. I see. I've never heard of it before. Obviously, it is, region specific, but yeah, I've never heard of it before. So it's endlessly fascinating, this one. So
Yeah.
the scope, what's the scope for it? How many of these things are they doing?
Well, it's sort of dying out, as you can imagine. But I know about Mongolia from an anthropologist who is still practiced up there. She's still seeing these experimental birthmarks in Mongolia today, working with people. Um, it's still practiced somewhat in Thailand and Burma, but it's beginning to die out there. At any rate, what I want to talk about in Japan, the experimental birthmarks, and they're because different things are used to make them, right? And this is partly where the coloring comes from. So in Burma and Thailand, the typical thing to use is the soot from the bottom of a cooking pot, and so the birthmarks tend to be dark,
Okay.
right? In one case, however, where a more modern case of this, um, um, a girl's friend used her lipstick, on the back of the neck, and the kid was born with a red mark on the back of the neck.
So the important question I need to ask here is is it slicing into the body, or are you just marking, like drawing on somebody?
It's like drawing on somebody.
Okay.
And um yeah, now we'll get into that. You're getting into the experimental birth, what we can call experimental birth defects, which is West Africa. We'll get to that in a sec. But let
Okay.
me give me this Japanese thing first, because in Japan, then what they use to these marks is there is what is it called? I mean, they have the ink that they make for their calligraphy. They use that. It's made from it's a natural dye sort of thing, and they use that same thing for these experimental birthmarks. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and often with experimental birthmarks, they'll write the name. Okay, which is
Okay.
just a character. It's just a
Yeah,
character. I
yeah.
mean, it's not like So they write the character of the name. So um, there is this one guy who he was a simpleton. I mean, a serious simpleton. And but he died, and he was called um, something the simpleton, and so this the 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 experimental birthmark that was put in his body was, the calligraphy was his name, and then the
That's
word
simpleton.
simpleton.
Yeah.
Okay, so then a child is born who has this birthmark of these
Mm.
two, and quite legible, right, of these two characters on his arm. Um, the family in which he was, which is amazing enough.
Yeah.
Um, but there is also in Japan this, if you want to get rid of a birthmark, there are ways to do it. And so the family didn't like the simpleton part of the thing on his arm, and use this technique, to get rid of that part of the birthmark. Anyway, it's a 19th century case, but it's a well documented one, and by it was written up by a British author, actually, Lafcadio Hearn. Is one of Hearn's cases. Anyway,
It's quality, though, isn't it? That you can do such a thing, and
that you
there
can
is
do so.
actual
I mean, the
proof.
whole right, exactly. And so I mean, both the idea that you that you write, in such detail, on a cadaver, and have that reproduced on a living body, and then get rid of it. I mean, all of this stuff is it's like
Well,
weird.
it makes you think that we should return to this process. Obviously, people giving their consent and stuff to write quite complex things, like I died this date, this place. And
Right.
would
Or
that all
he
come
or he
through?
died or he
Yeah.
died. I mean, but I suppose you could do it too. I mean, if
Hmm.
you have, if you could do it yourself. I mean, if you want close to your death, you could write it. But anyway, but yeah, I mean, yes, it does, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
and so it does raise the question about, can we do this really experimentally? That is, you know, and Stevenson tried, and he tried to get this going in Sri Lanka, which is an area that does not have this tradition.
Okay.
Okay, and it didn't work. And I think the reason that it didn't work there is precisely because they don't have the tradition.
They didn't buy
Because,
into it.
well, because what would be required here, and see what the suggestion here, and what the suggestion is, I think it has to be a requirement. That is, the consciousness has to be hanging around the body after it's died. The consciousness then has to see that the body is being marked. Now, if you live in a culture where this is done routinely, you can sort of understand how after you die, you might want to do that, see if anybody is going to mark your body. And if you then you can carry it forward to your next body, right? In this psychogenic way I've been talking about.
Hmm.
If, however, you die and you just go immediately someplace else, you're not there to see the marking.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I think it has to be done, in an area where you have the tradition, or you have to, if you're doing an experimental sample, you have to tell people before they die, this is what you're going to do and what's expected. Not tell them necessarily what the mark is going to be, right? But tell them to expect it. Then you mark the body, in some sort of randomized way, and then try to find it and try to find somebody with that particular mark.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's several things that have to go on here, but in principle, it is something that could be done experimentally.
Yeah. I'd love to see something. Obviously, there would have to be a lot of people buying into the scenario itself and doing it, but I would love to see a wide-ranging experiment on that because that would be fascinating, endlessly fascinating.
Wouldn't it be?
Hell
Okay, now
yeah.
before you go on to your next question, so let
Hmm.
me jump to the experimental birth defects.
Sure.
Maybe that was your next question. Um, so this is West Africa, and okay, so I again, it's a wide area, all the way from Senegal on the Atlantic coast, all the way to apparently past Nigeria, but certainly in that area. There is this practice, which is probably very old, because in each language is a different word for it, and the practice is different too. But basically, what they do is, um, if several children in a family die in infancy in quick succession, so the children just aren't living, right? They just keep dying.
Hmm.
Um, Somehow or other, the idea got started that are these children are all incarnations of a spirit that is doing this just to molest the parents, right? Um, and the way to stop it, but this spirit band of which there are members are very vain, okay, and they will only accept the body back if it's intact. So, in order to stop this cycle, what you do is you maim the body in some way. So, in Nigeria, among the Igbo, and a lot of Stevenson's cases were Igbo cases of this. They nick more than nick. They cut off the end of one of the fingers. Okay, in Senegal, it was an earlobe that was nicked. Okay, so but amazingly, there are children born among the Igbo and among the Ser in Senegal without without the end of their fingers, or with
Without
missing
an
parts of
earlobe.
their ears.
Mm.
So we call those experimental birth defects. Just because the others are called experimental
Yeah.
birth defects, and so yeah, it's another just crazy thing. And but again, I mean, it comes back to the psychogenic idea, right? And these kids live. I mean, the thing is, that's probably why they continued. If they don't die again.
Which proves it,
So
doesn't it?
for these people, it
Yeah.
just proves that it makes the point. So
Well, that means you can't disprove that tradition as a thing, can you?
no, you can't. But what you can disprove is it has anything to do with malaria. And because that's people who try, well, no, seriously, the materialists who try to explain this away say that malaria can cause these sorts of problems. And this is just a misunderstanding of malaria. Well, they actually went, and Stevenson, they went and they studied this, and it has nothing to do with malaria at all.
No.
No, it just doesn't.
No.
So they disproved that. But I mean, this is you'll see that out there. I mean, they're still out there.
I've never heard of this one either, but again, that's more corroboration for the whole thing.
Yeah.
But that's whoa. I need to
I
look into that
know.
one myself.
right. I mean, all of this is just one thing after another. Just whoa, whoa,
It's
whoa.
what it's doing is two things here. It's proving the reincarnation is a thing, and it's saying that the mind is all powerful,
That's right. Yes. Yeah, that's right.
which then would back up loads of other theories we think about the mind, wouldn't it? If you could go down many rabbit holes
It
with
would.
that. But
Yeah.
yeah. So I want to talk about, I mean, we briefly covered this earlier about the intermissions. I mean, I spoke to Lloyd Auerbach last week, and he
Okay.
said that the average was something like 15 months between death and new life. Is that what you found? And is there a reason why that specific average? I know there has to be an average, but why 15 months?
Okay. Yeah, what Lloyd is talking about is from Stevenson's research, and it's not the average, but the median.
Okay.
So it's not the mean, but the median. That means as many cases shorter than that is longer.
Yeah.
Um, and it also was Stevenson's collection, which is predominantly Asian cases. Okay. So
Hmm.
in Asian cases, yes, the median intermission is only 15 months, very short. That doesn't mean there are a lot, not longer ones too. The longest one in a case that Stevenson studied was 82 years
Whoa.
in Sri
Was
Lankan case.
that so still an Asian one? So that consciousness is hanging around for 82 years on that
82
basis.
years. That's right.
Mm.
Now we can't, when long intermissions like that, we can't be sure there weren't intervening lives.
Yeah, that's true.
Because
Yeah.
some of these cases they remember multiple lives, and sometimes sometimes the penultimate one is solved and the intervening one is not. But anyway, you can't be sure when you've got very long intermissions, like, because that's long enough for there to be a full life in between.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But anyway, that's a so but anyway, the reason that I make the distinct is the reason it's important to understand this is based on Asian data, is that as we've studied more Western cases now, we've seen that in the Western intermission lengths, they tend to be much longer. Like in Ryland's case, she was born in so um I think it was 25 years. I mean, so uh which is right on the median, again, for Western or American stranger cases, those with stranger, relationships between the lives. And it's about the same in the UK and in Europe in general. Now, um, with another thing to say here is that with family cases, it tends to be somewhat shorter than with stranger cases for some reason. So the intermission is shorter if you come back in the same family, but it's still longer than the 15 months. I mean, talking about 3, 4, 5 years instead of 25, 30, 40 years.
Mm.
Um, uh, the intermission also tends to be shorter when there's a violent death, um, and when children die very young. Um, so children who die young often come back to the same mothers, just like we're talking about in West Africa, where they think the same child is coming back again and again and again. That fits with what we see, because when children die in infancy or very young, they typically do return to the same mothers.
So like they chose the mother, they knew that was the right
That's
one.
right.
They just
That's
want to go
right.
back.
They just want to go back. That's right. That's the
Mm.
implication there. Yeah.
And what's the implication of the difference between the median in the Western world versus Asian? Do you think it's population size based? So because they got more population over there, they go quicker back in.
Right. Yeah, population density may be a
Yeah.
factor here, because if you've got more births, and I mean, there's more chance of coming back more quickly. Another idea is perhaps in the West we have this idea, and I keep hearing it again and again and again in my Facebook group. It's a very strong one, that we're going to meet our loved ones again when we die. Okay.
Hmm.
Um, and you also find in the West we have a tradition of mediumship, right?
Yeah.
And going back in the history of spiritualism, I mean, this is one of the reasons why it took so long for reincarnation really to catch on, because in early 20th century spiritualism, they were very opposed to reincarnation because they couldn't understand, they said, how you can communicate to mediums if you have reincarnation. But if you're taking decades before you reincarnate, there's plenty of time to communicate to a medium or be seen as an apparition or, what have you, or wait for your loved one to die, right? So I think that may be a factor.
Right, so the factor there is because we have this medium connection, consciousnesses are hanging around in the non-corporeal state because they can communicate that way. Whereas in the Asian world, they don't necessarily have that mediumship sort of like belief, so they go back in the body straight away. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, because they see it more all governed by karma.
Yes. Do you think karma's a thing?
No, I don't. Again, coming back to the cases, neither did Stevenson. It's just no researcher does, because we just don't see the evidence in the cases. It's just not there.
Right. So none of the youngsters come back with I didn't do this, or I was bad and therefore I need to be good now. We don't hear any stories of that.
Well, we do sometimes. But we can. I'll give you an example of a Sri Lankan case. It's an interesting one. A guy killed his fiancée, or they have two stages to the wedding ceremony. She had passed the first stage, but not to the second. She tried to back out of the wedding, of the marriage.
Okay.
He wouldn't have that. It probably justifies her completely, because he wouldn't have it, and he killed her.
Oh, God.
And so he was tried and he was hung for that. And it took him a long while. It took him, I think, 18 years or something like that. A very long intermission for Asia. But he came back with part of his arm missing. A stunted arm, a really striking birth defect. This is another case in 20 cases in Stevenson's first book, of case reports. And he credited it to his karma. He said that he was born, with this deformity because he had used this arm then to kill his bride.
I see.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So he, okay. But you can also interpret that on my point of view, right? He feels guilty about this. And so he causes this, thinking that this is his karmic due and this is this result. So he brought this about himself.
Yeah. So again, the belief plays into the mind. The power of the mind alters the body.
Right, exactly.
Yes, that makes sense on your paradigm. Yes, no, I can completely understand. I don't know where I sit on karma, because I've spoken to a lot of people on the mediumship side of things, and on another topic that we'll discuss in a second, which is the regression side of things, past lives, future lives, and all that side of things. And I don't quite know where I sit. Now, I know you sit on it doesn't exist, because the data has led you down. I get that. I haven't seen your data, so do you know what I mean?
Right. I understand that. Yeah. People have to sort of, but that's why you interview people like me, because it takes us a while. Lloyd also. I mean, he's been at this decades, right? It takes a long time to get to.
Well, the key thing, isn't it? You have knowledge in your head that I don't have. I want to know what you've got in your head.
Right. But again, if you haven't lived, I know. But again, you and your audience, you have to trust us, right? They would know what we're talking about. And so it always comes down to that. But okay. So to go on to these issues then, I mean, I am talking about, everything I say is grounded in the data that I've seen over the time I've been working on this. And with regressions, and I've already said a little bit about them, there's just very few of them check out. Some do, okay, but even when they do, there can be errors. Like, I don't know, many of you, I'm not sure how I asked her. I should ask her, Jenny Cockle or Cockell. She has a famous case. It's a very famous case. Many of your listeners will be aware of that, your viewers. Because it's a British case. She remembered a life in Ireland, and went back and actually contacted, the surviving family members or children. Um, but anyway, um, she remembered a second life, and this isn't nearly as well known as that one. Um, um, she had a dream connected to that life, um, in which um, she was hit by a lorry, I believe. I think that was the dream. The aggression gave a completely different reason for the death. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The aggression, however, did give her the name, which allowed her to get hold of the death certificate. The death certificate gave as the cause of death a lorry hitting him. So the death certificate agreed with her dream that came to her spontaneously, not their aggression.
Sure.
And there are other aggressions like this, which are partly verified, but then there's something strategic about them that is wrong. I mean, there's a celebrated case of Captain Snow, police Captain Snow, who went through aggressions and was managed to find his past life. Well, yes, he did, but on the basis he saw him in his aggressions and saw also paintings.
Right.
He remembered names. The names didn't leave him anywhere. He couldn't. The names turned out to be wrong. He solved this case when he finally found those paintings he was painting. And he was probably led to him. So it's led to them psychically. This is another issue of how but anyway, he found those paintings. And then when he went back and learned about the life of the painter, things fit in with the details of a lot of his regression memories, right? So there's no question about that was the life he was recalling. It's just that the names that he was given in the regression turned out to be wrong. So you see, this is the sort of thing you do not get in spontaneous cases. It's very easy to get names under aggression, but they don't turn out right. It's hard to get names in spontaneous cases, but when you get them, they're right.
So what do you think it is then about the regression itself that's leading to and not the complete picture, i.e.
Well,
incorrect data?
right. I mean, I think it's I did touch on this earlier. I think it has to do with our subconscious resisting, um, and not wanting us to
Yeah.
know about these past lives, because when it's ready to let them go, they'll come up spontaneously. When it doesn't want to, and we're trying through hypnosis to learn what our past lives were, our subconscious doesn't like that. It wants to protect us, and so it puts up all these roadblocks to really understanding.
Yes, you did say that earlier. I do apologize. That makes sense. Why do you think the West hasn't adopted reincarnation as a mainstream belief?
Religion. And I think that's the beginning of it. I mean, I think it goes all the way back, to, and the interesting thing there, if we look at this historically, is reincarnation beliefs were all around the Eastern Mediterranean at the time of Christ, all around there. So, and you find them in Judaism too, early Judaism. And you find them. The Druze are actually an Islamic sect now, a Shia Islamic sects, and
Mm-hmm.
there's several Shia sects which have reincarnation beliefs. The Sunni do not, and Orthodox Islam does not. But these sort of heterodox Shia sects do. The thing is, they were in existence before Islam.
Okay.
Okay, and they're very close. It's in the Middle East, very close to where Israel is now.
Yep.
So I think that this is all, and the beliefs actually, some of the beliefs are really interesting, that they're very similar in Judaism as in the Shia, very similar.
Mm. So the religious
Which
side of things is control, yeah? If you
Yeah,
can take
and
away
the
the
religious,
realities.
yeah, that's right. I think that's the main reason. And then and then much later on, our sciences jumped in, and after materialism got hold of our sciences, then we just don't believe in anything that has to do with with consciousness being separate from the brain,
Do
or
you think there's
not.
going to be a resurgence of thinking along these lines because of shows like this that you're on now with me and the spread of social media with access to all this information now? Do you think the mind's going to open up again?
I think the mind is opening up again. I see these shows like this as more of a reflection of the change than driving it. But I'm sure there's this feedback thing, and that
Mm.
you're helping it. Um, the more important part of the change, because it's already happening at a popular level, the more important part of the change is what's beginning to happen in the scientific and academic level. And you are beginning to see people in different disciplines, in philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, that are beginning to question materialism and beginning to get on this bandwagon. And you're getting more and more of that.
Well,
So I
there's not
think
so
things,
much blowback, is there, these days? Like shame or you can't do that because of this. People are more free, aren't they?
well, yes and no. Um, I
Why they
mean,
know?
well, there's still a resistance. There's still a lot of resistance. I mean, it's still very hard to get into some journals, mainstream journals, with this sort of stuff. It can be hard to get into the parapsychology journals too. I mean, I have to fight to get reincarnation papers in. I do, but I have to dot every I, dot, and
Mm.
cross every T. I've got, there's still, I mean, there's still, there are a lot of people in parapsychology who still think this is all explainable by ESP.
Well, it can't be, can it? Not with all your cases and
No,
Stevenson's cases and then many others.
right. I don't think it can be at all, because because this isn't. It could be, maybe, if it's just information. If you're just talking about memories, but we're also talking about behaviors. We're talking about these physical things.
Yeah.
You
And then
know,
the cases where people go back and say, "I remember your name," go and see you, and I think
right,
Lloyd and I discussed a case in India where they go back and see the family, and then they become part of that new family.
right, exactly. I mean, this is very common in Stevenson's cases, because if you're talking about, the animation is so short. I mean, the previous family is still living.
Hmm.
The previous siblings, parents are still living. Friends are still living. And they go back there, and and one of the and there's some really interesting things about this. I mean, we it's always surprising to Westerners to hear that Asians don't always accept the kids, or and they're not always welcome, um, uh, to talk about these things either, because there's a strong fear that the previous families are going to try to take them away, or there
Hmm.
are there fears that, they hardly ever do, but there is that fear, or there is this myth that the children who remember previous lives are going to die young. No substance to that either. And yet, and so they have these various things. Like Ravi Shankar, they actually, the kid with the birthmark is an example. His father used one of these ritual things, turning him counterclockwise on a potter's wheel. That was supposed to make his memories go away.
That's not really scientific, is it? It's not one of your
No.
experiments, is it? No.
No, but this is the sort of thing that they will do in Asia to try to
Hmm.
keep the children from talking about the previous lives.
Yeah, on zero basis whatsoever. Uh, if reincarnation is real, and I'm on your side, by the way, I strongly believe it is. What purpose is it serving? I.e., what is the bigger picture? I think you alluded to the evolution of consciousness alongside evolution of the body. Are you still on that, or do you think there's a bigger picture right there?
Yeah, I'm still on that, really, frankly.
Okay.
I don't see now. It's possible that that in some cases that there's some sort of life planning, and and there's some, we're trying to advance spiritually, all these things that you hear. Um, I When we compare, and remember, we only have 2 or 3 lives to compare, right? So, because
Hmm.
even though there may be memories of more lives than that, we only have 2 or 3 that we can confirm, right?
Okay.
And so that's what the research is concerned with, is with the lives we can confirm. And when we look at the lives that we can confirm, we don't see any sort of trajectory of growth. I mean, the things like, one example I like to give of this is I come back, another Sri Lankan case of a boy who remembered being a monk, a Buddhist monk. And he wanted to go back in the monastery, and his parents allowed him to go back in the monastery.
Okay.
He dropped out. He quit the monastery. He went into computer science.
Yeah, couldn't be any more
Now,
different.
this is, I mean, yeah, I mean, and so, I mean, the idea that we have, I mean, so if somebody is spiritually advanced enough to be in a Buddhist monastery, aren't they can continue that trajectory? Why are they going to reject all of that? And so, I mean, we just don't see this sort of growth that many Westerners like to imagine that reincarnation is about. I think
Mm.
that it is probably about something as simple um, as helping us adjust to our new lives. Because besides, coming back relatively quickly many times, we also come back in the same geographical region, if not that, then the same culture, same ethnicity, same cultural frame, our comfort zones, right?
Yeah,
Where we were before. Not that they're not exceptions, there are exceptions. And we can talk about them because they're interesting and instructive. And but let me stay with this for a moment.
sure.
Because if you come back in the same culture, even if you're not in the same town, speaking the same language, you've got a leg up, right? You learn your language more quickly. You adapt to things more easily. You're not put off by the climate. You're not put off by the food. Everything just it's just easier. It's just
And boy,
easier.
I'd be put off by the food. So.
Whereas in international cases, and there are some, there are a good number of them, you see exactly the opposite. If people, the kids who remember having been in Britain or the United States before, they hate the climate, they hate the clothes. I mean, they just. There's a Sri Lankan girl who finally, in her 20s now, managed to get out to Italy where she feels better. She just hated it in Sri Lanka, absolutely hated it.
Mm. Obviously, brought that with her then and thought, no. See, that's just thrown up a question for me. My girlfriend's American, right? And felt
Mhm.
a desire to come to this country. She says well, she says it's because she wanted to do horses stuff. Yeah, she's well into horses and that. But could there be another component to that in the background?
Well, it could be. Yeah, I mean,
Hmm.
definitely. I mean, because there are plenty of horses in the United States too. I mean, she could have done
Yeah.
horses here, but yes, I mean, very often people, I mean, they feel drawn back to, to the country that they recall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a thought I'm going to discuss with her later on, I think. It's quite a good one. Um, so on this basis that it's just an evolution of body, stroke, consciousness running side by side, who is controlling that? Is there something else controlling it, or is it just that mind state of that person acting individually, bringing themselves back?
Well, I think the latter, but you also have to realize, I mean, there are sort of natural processes in this. I mean, birth and death. I mean, these are sort of, I mean, we all go through the same series of events, and in our and developmentally as we grow up, right? And if we age and all of this, and so there is this natural process to it that we have some control over. I mean, there are things that we can do to live longer, right? I mean, but we still have a finite end to our life, and there's still this course, and we still, so I think that there is. So you see, what I'm saying is, yeah, I mean, there does seem to be sort of a natural progression to this. Um, but I don't think that you have to say then that there is something, a God or anything
Hmm.
else that's guiding it, right? I mean, it's just that this somehow developed. Now, maybe, I mean, if we think of a deity in the right way, if we don't think of the deity as somebody up on high, whatever, but in more of as a force or something like this, if we
Hmm.
think of it in that way, maybe that is sort of the ground of consciousness that everything is part of, and maybe we can get to that idea somehow there. But no, I don't think there's anything like karma or or God or religious, anything like this that is controlling or determining things.
Do you know what image has come to my mind while you were saying that? It's the flow of a river, and that we're all on this river, and there's life A, just down river bit is life B, down C. You mentioned it earlier. The body
Right.
comes out and goes, and then maybe
Right.
that intermission bit is the part where you are the stick caught up on a rock in the middle of the river, and then you
Yeah,
think,
yeah,
"Oof, that I
yeah.
don't know why." Weird imagery, but hey ho.
But yeah, it works. And
Yeah, it does. That's where my mind's going to sit anyway. No one's going to tell me otherwise, and they can't disprove it. Um, Now you wrote a book, didn't you, called Signs of Reincarnation? A, what drove you to write it, and B, how has it been received?
oh, um, what drove me to write it? Well,
Hmm.
this goes way back. I mean, so I think I mentioned, didn't I, that I started off wanting to be a creative writer,
That's right.
right? And so when I went into my library and looking around for other things to write about, um, that was my original idea. I wanted to write a book about reincarnation because at that time there wasn't one as a good survey. They came out just very quickly after that, just a couple of years later. You started seeing these, but there wasn't one then. And so I thought, well, this is a good thing I can write. So my idea of writing a book went back to the beginning. And so I think it's like always in my mind. Um, I wrote in 1990, sort of maybe an interim thing, um, which is a long as 186 page review of everything of all the research that had been done at that point, that was published in one of these advances, in different fields. This was advances in parapsychology. It's sort of this long review article, looking at where we are now. Um, and so that was sort of it for a while, because these other books had come out, things like Scott Ruggo's book, that had treated it in a more popular way. So I wanted to do, and by this point I'm solidly academic, right?
Hmm.
um, and more academic, and so yeah, I just continued to think about it for this long time, and I guess what led me to it, and I couldn't figure out how I was going to write a book. What led me to it is I was invited to develop a semester-long course on reincarnation. And I did. That course was I still teach it, but it was dropped. It was for Atlantic University, the ARE outfit, in Virginia Beach, Virginia. But that program was canceled, and along with it, my course. But I continued to develop it. Um, and but I so I wanted to write out my lectures for that course to give me some guidance on what I wanted to say. And if I'm writing out my lectures, I knew from the beginning that I would probably eventually want to pull them into a book. And that's the basis of my course lectures,
Gotcha.
of my book. So the course gave me a framework in which to talk about all of it, what we're talking about now, right? And pull it all together. It gave me the framework, and then writing the lectures got me in the first draft of the book, and so that's what it came. Now, how's it been received? Um, about what you would expect. I mean, some people, like the Parapsychological Association, gave me an award for it, one of these,
Oh, lovely.
best book of the year awards. Um, Reviewers have been sort of split. Some of them have been very good. The most skeptical reviewers have been very hostile to it.
Oh, well, you have to
So
just discount that data.
yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, the PA giving me the best book of the year award was nice.
Oh, amazing. Excellent. Um, the other book which you co-authored, I Saw a Light and Came Here, Children's Experience of Reincarnation. Um, the I Saw a Light and Came Here part, is that from an actual case?
It is. It is. And, that's sort of, um, yeah, I caught that with Erlander Haraldsson, who's an Icelandic parapsychologist, who's no longer, he passed a few years ago now. Um, but he was one of the major parapsychologists who was working in field stuff. And he worked with Stevenson some. And when Stevenson was looking for people to study the reincarnation cases, to try to replicate his research, Erlander was one of the people he tapped. Um, so when Erlander, toward the end of his life, got ready to write his book, he asked me to co-author it with him to bring in a different perspective, because Erlander had worked in Sri Lanka, among the Druze in Lebanon, and his native Iceland, but didn't really, know that much beyond that, right? Whereas I knew the literature, and so could combine, could provide that perspective. So that's how that book came about. And at first we were going to do it in a traditional sort of way where we both wrote, each chapter. And because I was working on my other book at the time and I didn't have time to get to it, and he had written all his chapters, we hit on what I think was actually the better way of doing it. And he has the first part of the book with his chapters, and then I have the last third of the book with mine. And so I could do with what I wanted with it. So that's how that book came about. Now, so the I saw a light and came here actually comes from one of Erlander's cases. It's something that one girl said, that after she died, she saw a light, and came here, meaning she was reborn.
Yeah.
And it sort of reminds people of near-death experiences, right? Because
Yes, that's what it did to me. Yeah.
Yeah. And and some of the but in a way it's misleading, because we don't see that much of an overlap between, well, we do structurally. I was talking about this earlier, but we don't. They're very rarely. This is one of 2 or 3 cases only when a light is mentioned in an intermission memory. We hardly ever hear about tunnels. So there's some near-death phenomena which are very common, that are very uncommon. So in a way, it gives a misleading sort of thing, but it is a catchy title, isn't it? It comes from there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I liked it. We're going to ask you one more question before we enter the Koit zone, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
A question I ask everybody, which is, what strange thing or things have happened to you? So that could be you seeing a ghost, a UFO, or just a random weirdo person that you've met in your life. But what strange thing or things have happened to you?
Oh, I've had several. I'll give you one example,
Mm-hmm.
because I think it's an interesting one. Chester Carlson was mainly the person who backed Stevenson. He was inventor of the Xerox process.
Okay.
And so he made a lot of money from that, obviously.
I bet.
And yeah,
he printed money, literally.
Yeah. So he had a lot of money, and he got interested in parapsychology. And he backed Rhine. He actually backed Stevenson, and he backed the ASPR in New York, where I worked for a while. Now, so yeah, I'll get to my thing, but before I get to my thing, I mentioned before I was librarian and archivist there. My predecessor in the library, shortly after she got there, looked up one day, and she saw the top half of a man's body, just the top half of it. So her reaction was, as you can imagine, this is the first time we've seen an apparition like that. But she told Carlos Osis, who was the research officer at the time, about it. And Carlos pulled out some photographs, and he lined up these photographs, 5 photographs for her, and said, was it one of these men? And she pointed to that one. Yes, it was him. It was Chester Carlson.
Amazing.
So it seems then that Chester Carlson may be haunting the place, right? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So then a few years later, I'm still in the library, and I'm talking with somebody about a person who's downstairs. So we're talking in hushed tones, and all of a sudden, there were display cases in the wall, and I saw like a shadow past a display case, as if somebody would come up the stairs and just shadow in the display case. At the same time, she heard footsteps. I did not hear the footsteps. She was facing into the room, not in a position to see the shadow. We both, however, immediately stopped talking without saying anything to each other, immediately both together walked out into the hall and there's nothing there.
Mm. Shared psychic experience.
Yes, and a shared apparition, and maybe
Yeah,
Chester Carlson.
that is strange. I've never seen a shadow or anything like that, but I've had a couple of strange things happen to me. But so yeah, these things do happen. Um, and it reminds me of the conversation again. If in fact, if anyone hasn't seen this, go back and look at the episode I did with Lloyd last week, where we talk about ghosts that appear just like from the top up, and the
Yeah.
explanations given about
Yeah.
that. That's interesting. We are now entering the Koit zone.
Koit Zone!
Okay.
Now, in the Koit zone, this is all about you as a person, so it's your personality. So there'll be random questions, trivial questions, it doesn't matter. Answer best you can. So,
Well,
first question.
If I've gotten this far with you, I'll go the rest of the way. So,
Good man. Right, first question. Steak. How do you like it?
oh, a medium rare, I guess.
Medium rare.
Medium well, medium well.
Medium well. Let's push it on that bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really like the rare side so much. Really, medium well.
Okay, here's a strange question. Have you ever found something whilst digging? Could be a treasure, could be just something random.
Yeah, biting red ants.
Yeah, they're not good. Next question. Do you remember a time that you laughed so hard that your sides were hurting and you almost couldn't breathe? You ever had that?
Yeah, it's happened to me. Can I remember when or why? No, I can't.
No, that's fair enough.
Off the top of my head.
Okay. On similar vein, who's your favorite comic, if you have one?
Probably Peanuts.
Peanut. Oh no, not not comic in the written sense.
Oh, in that sense.
Yeah,
I
comedian.
don't know. Robin Williams, maybe.
That's a good choice. Yeah, I like Robin Williams. What's the most scared you've ever been?
I can't think of anything immediately, so just go on.
Okay. If that comes back to you, let me know.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you cook? And if so, what's the best thing you make?
Yeah, I spent 20 years as a vegetarian, and living on my own, and I had to teach myself to cook to be a vegetarian. And this was back before it was fashionable, and so you couldn't find, this also starts back in the 70s. So, yeah, I learned pretty quickly, that I have to invent things, because I tried to make things that I remembered that I liked, but I didn't know what I could substitute, what I couldn't, and so
Yeah.
I learned very quickly. I just had to go on my own and wing it. I don't know that I have any.
You don't have a signature dish for yourself?
Yeah, I don't know that I do. I just continue to be creative with whatever is I have. But yeah, I tend to cook vegetarian.
Good stuff. Yeah, my girlfriend's a vegetarian and she's on the same basis. She just throws it all in a pan and calls it a new creation. A very simple question. Sunlight or moonlight? Which tells you, are you a day or a night person?
Which do I prefer?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, they both have. I like both, frankly.
Okay, you don't have to choose. You answer it best you see fit.
Yeah, I don't know that I would want to choose. I mean, they both have their, I mean, I like both of them. I mean, for different reasons.
No, that's fair enough. Do you remember the first song you ever bought? First record.
First song that I ever bought.
Yeah.
Probably Simon and Garfunkel, but I don't remember really.
I like Simon and Garfunkel. They're good choices. Fair play. How many cars have you owned in your life?
Well, I've driven several cars. I've owned just one.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. I mean, the others have been sort of passed downs, and so I've been fortunate that way. But the one car I have now is, and if you want to know what kind of car it is, it's a hybrid.
Okay, no, fair enough. One car is quite a low number. I was not expecting that one.
Well, no, I mean, how many cars have I driven? I mean, how many cars have I driven? I don't know, 5, 6, something like that. But they've all been passed down through the family.
Sure, no, fair play. Does Santa exist?
In people's minds.
I like it. I knew you'd answer that sort of way. You can't say no, can you? Here's a strange one. Have you ever been in a fight?
I've ever been in a fight.
Yeah.
I've had people fight me. Um, uh, but I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think probably when I was 7 or 8 or something like that, but I don't really remember those things very well.
No, that's good. It's good. Favorite movie?
Um, this is going to sound very strange, but it may be A Clockwork Orange. And the reason that is that I came out of that movie actually laughing. I thought I think Kubrick did a very good idea. He did very well at undercutting the violence. And I contrast that to The Godfather. I came out of The Godfather wanting to strangle somebody. I came out of The Clockwork Orange actually laughing. And that's why I like it.
It's very subvertive. It had a sort of clownish appeal to the violence, didn't it? Because the way they dressed and everything and acted. Whereas
That's right.
Godfather is grounded in reality. You know that is happening probably. What animal would you say is secretly planning to take over the world?
Well, I don't know I don't even think that. So no, I don't know. I thought you were going to ask. I thought you were going to. Oh, okay. Well, that's fine. I'm a cat person. I thought you were going to ask what my favorite animal is or something like that. My favorite.
Well, still go with that. You can still go with that. What animal is your favorite?
Hedgehog.
Ah, amazing. I visited a hedgehog rescue center very, very recently. Lovely little things. Yeah, we got loads of them around here. That is the end of the Koit Zone. I told you it would be random.
Okay, yes.
Last two questions. What else do you like to do in your downtime? Any activities or guilty pleasures?
Oh. Do I have any? You're implying that I have downtime.
Yeah, that means you're always working, yeah?
I am. I mean, seriously. I mean, either talking to you, people like you, or I'm researching, I'm writing, or cooking, or doing something else that I need to do. I'm divorced now, and so I don't. And my daughter's in college, so I don't really have any responsibilities to family anymore, and I just work.
No, that's fair enough. If that's what you'd like to do, work. That is your answer. No, that's fair
I'm an
enough.
introvert. I'm introverted enough. That's what I like to do.
Look, then you're in the right place, aren't you? If you're doing what you like to do, that's it. You're on the right path. Final question. What are you currently working on?
Like 3 or 4 different papers, maybe more than that, if I count up all the ones that I have in mind. Actually, one of the this actually is a good question because it gets us off into a different tangent and maybe something you'll want to have me back to talk about. I've gotten interested in animals. Rupert Sheldrake. I don't know if you've had him, but certainly you know who he is and your literature. Yeah. And another friend of mine, Michael Nahm, who's a German biologist, wrote a journal paper on end-of-life experiences of animals.
Oh.
Okay. When I saw that paper, I thought, God, we got to go to the next step. And I wrote to Michael about it. And at that time, neither of us thought that Sheldrake would want to continue because he is not, so I started to, and when my Facebook group and others, I started asking, do you have any after death communications from animals? Because what they did in their paper was show how similar the end of life experiences of animals are to people's. They're very similar. Okay. And I had read enough of these things to know that they're also then after death communications from animals that are similar to people, right? I mean, people see apparitions of animals, they hear animals, they'll see partial apparitions, all of these things. And so we did this study. It's now in press. It'll be out in March. And the first one was co-authored with Sheldrake and Michael Nahm. And now But he didn't want to get into the really interesting things, the theoretical stuff, which is, does this really suggest, as it clearly does, that animals survive death like people do? And this is what my interest is, because I'm going to go on after this to animal reincarnation, and which I got a lot of data on that too, because this fits into my whole theoretical thing that reincarnation goes back to origin of life, and that reincarnation is within species lines. And so I want to see, can I show that, right? And indeed, a lot of the reincarnation animal cases are of that, but then there are all these after death communication cases, which are they're just exactly like humans. And it's to the point that the majority human after death communications are visual. Same with animals. The least common are olfactory with humans. The least common with animals are olfactory. With humans, you've got the majority very close to death. So within the first 24 hours, 36 hours, same with animals.
Whoa. So there's a massive topic here well, look, if you will come back in the future, I would love to talk about this topic. I love animals. And it throws out the question, if you go on the basis you're saying, that means hedgehogs, your favorite animal, is also doing it.
That's correct. Yes, that's right. But they come back as hedgehogs, not as
Yeah. But then you could expand this out to then do ants do the same thing?
Yes. Oh, yes, definitely. I think so.
Oh, wow. Yes, I would definitely like to talk about that in the future. But for now, I will say thanks ever so much for your time, Jim. It's really appreciated. I think you've sent me down a different path than I expected to be sent down.
Well, that's good.
You subverted my expectations, which is a good thing.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm glad. And the same thing to your viewers, listeners. I hope I've sent them down the same,
Yeah, and on that basis, check out the description. Go and look at James's site. Go and look at his books. Go and buy them. I'm sure there's some shed load more information in them than what's been conveyed today. So I want to say thanks to Jim, and thanks to everyone for watching. Goodbye.
Okay, thank you, Koit. Bye.
Bye. To watch other KoitCast episodes, please click the image top left. To subscribe to my channel, please click the image top right. Please like and share to help KoitCast grow, and most importantly of all, please click the notification bell so you never miss an upload.